Good morning. It is so good to be together today. Good to see all of you here this morning. Everyone is looking so refreshed after that extra hour of sleep last night. It's always an exciting thing once a year. Glad that you're here today. If you're new here this morning, as Steve mentioned earlier, we're especially glad you're here. We want you to know that this is a church family that's trying to be like Jesus. And we invite you to share in what we do here and spend some time getting to know us this morning. Some of the sweetest, yet hard to accept words of Scripture we read just a moment ago. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. We read those words just a moment ago in our scripture reading, and I'm glad that Ron reminded us of what's going on in that passage when Paul says these words, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit as well. But in verses 9 and 10 of 2 Corinthians chapter 12, we find Paul receiving a reassuring word from Jesus and then telling us what that means to him. But he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." So Paul says, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. I'm content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. Over the past few weeks, we've been spending some time dwelling upon Paul's view of Christian mission, 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And if you've been here, I hope that that's been just a really beautiful, energizing passage for you. To me, it's just such a beautiful portrait of what God's mission looks like and how we can share in it. It inspires me to think about how God's at work in the world. He's reconciling the world to himself. He's bringing about a new creation in the world. That's what Paul says. And we can be a part of that. We can be ambassadors in the work that God is doing. If you're like me, when somebody really just gets down to the heart of things and names it, captures that vision of what can be, of what will be in God, that thrills me and excites me. I begin to think about the big things that we can do together to share in God's mission. Paul has this way of really capturing the vision, doesn't he? Catching that spark and kindling it into a flame. I think that's what great leaders do. But if we were to zoom out from that passage that we've been zeroed in on these past 5 or so weeks in 2 Corinthians 5, if we were to just zoom out and see what's really going on in Paul's life and in Paul's ministry, it might surprise us that he has this hope in him. That in the middle of these challenges that he faces, he is able to cast such a beautiful vision for what God is doing and how we can be a part of it. And that's what I'd like for us to do today, is to sort of zoom out just a little bit and take a look at what's going on in Paul's life and in his ministry, and talk about how really amazing it is that he has this hope in him. When I think about what Paul does in that passage we've studied, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, when he casts that vision, I think that is what a great leader is really able to do. A couple of Christmases ago, Alyssa got me a book for Christmas. I meant to bring it with me today, but I forgot it. It's a book called Great Speeches, Words That Shaped the World. It's a great book for someone who's interested in history, as I am, and also in speeches, someone who speaks publicly on occasion every now and then. And it also came with this wonderful technology called a CD-ROM, which if you don't remember it, you put it into a CD disk drive on your computer. It's really retro. And you can listen to some of the later versions or some of the later speeches contained in this book here. I just find it fascinating to read and listen to these great speeches because almost all of them share in common this quality of stirring up hope, of rousing courage by pointing to this thing that we believe is true and hold dear to no matter what. It's kind of like what Paul does in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And so in that book, there's examples of these great speeches. There's Winston Churchill, who had that gravelly, bellowing voice that would go out on the radio and across Great Britain and across the world. And he said, "Let us brace ourselves for our duties and so bear ourselves that in 1,000 years men will still say, 'This was our finest hour.'" And it's got Abraham Lincoln standing at the graves of Gettysburg, making a promise. This nation under God will have a new birth of freedom, and government by the people and for the people shall not perish from the earth. He takes a stand on that promise there. Or Martin Luther King on the steps of the Washington Monument, and that sort of got that melody to his voice as he says, "I have a dream." Like Paul does with the mission of God, all of these speeches cast a vision for what can be, for what should be. And yet all of those speeches I just named, as beautiful and stirring as they are, were spoken at a time when their vision was far from visible. They were spoken at a time when the things that were going on around those leaders as they said those words were not so great, when what they hoped for and what they were talking about seemed kind of unlikely to happen, maybe even impossible to happen. For Winston Churchill, when he dreamed about that finest hour for his people, it was at a moment when it seemed like it might be Great Britain's last hour if things didn't go well in their World War II fight with the Germans. For Lincoln, when he made that promise about a new birth of freedom, he did it while he stood on the stained earth of the bloodiest battle in American history. For Dr. King, when he talked about his dream of racial equality, he did it at a time when racial equality was just that, a dream. There were a lot of things standing in the way of it really happening here. What I'm saying is that these great speeches describe in this beautiful detail and in color this truth that is worth fighting for, that's worth holding on to, that's worth believing in. But they do it at a time when everything around them, all of the circumstances around them seem to be pointing to the contrary. I think this is what Paul does. I think this is what Paul does when he casts this vision about God's mission to the world and the fact that he's reconciling the world to himself and he's bringing about new creation and he's enlisting us as ambassadors in his work. When he casts that vision, he does it at a time when there was a lot of great hurt and struggle in his life. And there was a lot of great hurt and struggle in his ministry with the churches he was working with. And there was a lot of great struggle with the cultures and the world that surrounded him. Paul expresses his conviction that God is at work in the world at a time when everything that could go wrong for him seemed to have already gone wrong for him, when he'd been broken down a time or two, when the circumstances that were surrounding him gave him reason to doubt. In a word, when he was weak, he spoke those words. And I want to talk about, how does Paul hold on to that hope? Why does he do it at a time when he was weak? Let's take a moment and consider what's been going on for Paul as he shares in the mission of God. The mission of God has left bruises on Paul's back. It's left scars on his skin. He has been imprisoned. He tells us, he gives us a little list of just a little Reader's Digest version of what's been going on in his ministry. He's been imprisoned. He's been flogged 5 times, actually. He's been left for dead. He's been beaten with rods 3 times. He was stoned. 3 times he was shipwrecked. He found himself adrift at sea. Found himself in danger with his own people, in danger with not his own people, in danger when he was in the city, in danger when he was in the wilderness. This is what's been going on in Paul's life when he says those beautiful words about the mission of God. You wouldn't guess that if all we had was that 2 Corinthians chapter 5 passage we've been studying throughout October, when he says that in Christ all things are becoming new and everything old has passed away and now we have this new creation. This is what's been going on for Paul as he holds on to this hope. Beyond just those things, Paul says he feels a great anxiety for the churches that he's been working with. This is definitely true with the Corinthians. At the time that Paul writes this letter, he's deeply grieved that more than a few of the Christians there, some of them that he taught and raised up in the faith, are turning against him, slandering his name, turning away from his teachings. They're claiming that he is a deceptive person, that he's a hypocrite, that he's got false motivations for preaching the gospel. Paul gets quite exasperated with it all. He says, I've been a fool. You should have been commending me. I performed the signs of a true apostle among you with utmost patience, signs and wonders and mighty works for you. How have you been worse off than the other churches, except that I didn't even burden you with my work? You can hear the hurt in his voice. He said, forgive me this. I've given my whole life to you. This is the road that Paul's been on. Paul has been bruised, physically bruised for the gospel. He's been cut deep with the words of the very Christians he raised up in the faith. This has been a tough road. Paul has known what it means to be weak and to be in need. He's been on the short end of financial resources, food and water and clothing. He's been in toil and hardship through many a sleepless night, hungry and thirsty, often without food, cold and naked. He's carried out his ministry at times of scarcity, shorthandedness, lack of resource. All of this just astounds me. When I think about Paul's beautiful, hope-filled words for what God is doing and how we can be a part of it, bringing new creation, reconciling the world, he pens those very hope-filled words when he has truly known what it means to be weak. He says those words to live by when he himself has felt the distance between what he believes to be true deep down and really is true and what he's actually feeling and experiencing as he shares in the actual work of doing God's mission. How does he hold on to hope? And why? What keeps him going? I think I know how. Paul has heard, and he really believes, those sweetest yet hard to hear words of Jesus to him. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. As Ron mentioned in that chapter, he's talking about this thorn that he has in his flesh. It's really a strange chapter. These verses are beautiful and memorable, and I love them. It's kind of hard to know exactly what Paul is saying in that chapter. He says that a thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from being too elated. 3 times I appealed to the Lord about this, that it would leave me. He's troubled by this thorn in his flesh. Best we can tell, this thorn is sort of a metaphor for something going on in his life. It's hard to know exactly what. I'm not going to guess. But I will say that this thorn that he has in his flesh is a reminder of his weakness, isn't it? It's a reminder to not be too puffed up about himself or to think that he's more than he is. And if that's what it is, a reminder of his weakness, based on what we've just seen, it could be any number of things, right? We've seen just how many little reminders of his weakness Paul has been dealt throughout his ministry. And so he prays to God, take it away. Make me stronger. Make me strong again. But Jesus sweetly reminds him where his true power lies. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. For the first few days of this week, I wasn't really precisely sure where I ought to turn next in my preaching after we spent that time in our missions month looking at 2 Corinthians 5. I chose to turn here today because I want to say today that if we are serious about embracing our part in God's mission to the world, and that's a gleaming hope, and I think we're already showing we're serious about that, and we want to do that. If we're serious about doing that, doing so is going to remind us of the places where we are weak. And let's face it, as is true of every person and every group everywhere, there are places in our lives as individuals, there are places in our life as a group together where sometimes we're reminded of what it feels like to be weak, where we see the distance between what we believe and hope and know deep down to be true, what God is doing, and what we're actually going through and feeling as we try to be a part of it. In our world, we live in a place that doesn't think too highly of weakness. We don't like it very much. It goes against the American grain to think highly of weakness. We much prefer independence, power, strength, control. I mean, just take a look at the movies that we love in our culture. I was doing a little quick math this week, and I think that Americans have spent at the box office almost $4 billion on superhero movies in the past 5 years alone. It tells you a little bit about the stories we love, right? Stories of people who are larger than life heroes, who are stronger than the rest. Everything they need, all of the power they have is already within them. They just have to find it and conquer what's going against them in life. But for those of us who share in God's mission and march to the beat of God's drum, we think about power a little differently than that. Paul is learning to look at the reminders of his own weakness in his life. The bruises and the wounds and the empty pockets and the empty plates and the hurt in his life. And he's seeing that these things in God could actually become the greatest strengths and blessings that his ministry could hope for. Because anyone who sees Paul in the midst of all these weaknesses, persevering still, can only see him. Can only see that it's God's strength working in him. Anyone who sees Paul in these moments can be certain God alone is strong and sufficient. And when we are weak, God is still strong. Maybe today you need to hear this message. Maybe in your own life, and I know what this can be like, maybe you can be quick to write off what God has done or can do in you because you just can't seem to see past your own shortcomings, your own slip-ups, your own struggles. Maybe it's time to ask, could those very struggles become, in God's hands, a strength and a blessing to doing God's work? Could it be that God desires to remind you and display through you the message that when I am weak, God is still strong? Maybe this is a message we need to hear together today as a church. And when we do face obstacles and struggles as a church family, such as those that are brought on when we have loss among us, or illness among us, or conflict among us, or change among us, could we learn as a church to view those very challenges as open doors for God to say in us, see how they endure, see how they hold on, see their faith, that even in weakness says, I am still strong. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. After all, the very hope of the gospel we proclaim is a story of power made perfect in weakness. The power of God to heal and to save is made available to the world through the willing choice of Christ to be weak, to surrender. With his last and failing breath on the cross, Jesus breathed the hope of a grace that is strong enough, sufficient enough for you and me. And in that act of powerful weakness, Jesus invited the broken and the weak into the mighty arms of God, so that when we are weak, we can know that our God is and always will be strong. Today we offer an invitation, and maybe the invitation for you today is to join the mighty arms of God, to bring your weakness before Him, the hurt or the sin that's in your life, and turn it over to Him, because when we are weak, God is still strong. Maybe this is the kind of message that changes our outlook, challenges us to consider when we face struggles in our families or in our church family or in our own lives. Could these be ways that God is teaching us to rely on His strength, to be an example of how He and only He is strong, and His grace is sufficient for us? Whatever the case may be in your life or in your heart today, we offer this moment to respond to the word that we have heard from His word as we stand and as we sing.